Hello and welcome back to another session. Today we're looking at portraits. So let's begin by looking at some examples of human portraits from history. How do they differ in facial expression, painting style, lighting, colour, atmosphere, level of detail? How many of them are self-portraits? Which ones do you think were commissioned for a specific reason, and which ones were painted simply because the artist wanted to paint them? Think about the people we see in these portraits. Were they rich and influential, or, quote, ordinary individuals who would not have been remembered but for their portrait? What do you think the artist was interested in? For example, the intricate detail of clothing or skin texture. Which portraits do you think are realistic depictions of their subject? And which ones do you think have been idealized or distorted? What do you find surprising about them? Which ones do you find surprising? Which ones leap out at you for being different? Does the portrait tell a story? Does it look posed or natural? Is the subject painted in a setting or context that tells us something about them? Are they surrounded by objects that are relevant to them? If so, think about what we've learned about still life and what the significance of this element of the portrait might be. What adjectives spring to mind? For example, calm, intimidating, serious, powerful, enigmatic, pensive, macabre, beautiful, controversial, proud, and so on. Which ones would you hang on your own wall and why? If you're new to portraits or haven't had that much experience or just feel like you lack confidence with portraits, I would strongly suggest that you start by using photo references. I tend to collect photo references wherever I find them, in magazines, books, online, on the Pixabay website, pixabay.com, that I mentioned in the last sessions. You can find them in calendars, in catalogues, in newspapers. Have a rummage around, see what you find. You can also obviously take your own photo references of family, friends, yourself to work from. Portrait references obviously have the great advantage that they don't move. Portrait references like these, which I've collected over the years from all sorts of different sources, these are very varied, different types of face, different sorts of expressions, different sorts of facial hair or lack thereof, and particularly different angles of viewing the face. So you've got, of course, ones where you're looking at that face from the front, like so again, like so again, different expression. Okay, but also you've got really interesting faces that are looking to one side. I think the chin is slightly lowered on that one. It's really raised in this one, again looking up, looking away. When we are taught about portraits at school, for example, the general advice is that a portrait consists of, roughly speaking, an oval, and halfway down the oval you have the eyes, and halfway down from there you have the bottom of the nose, halfway down there you have the mouth, and so on, and you have this very strong line down the middle. Fair enough. That makes sense if you have something that basically resembles a passport photo. However, most portraits, at least most what I would think of as more interesting portraits, tend to be sort of off to one side, a tilt, or looking up, looking down, different expressions, you name it, different hairstyles. There's so many variations there, but all of those are going to completely throw out that system of the oval and the lines. So that oval and lines are only really helpful if you've got something that looks like a passport photo. So bear that in mind. However, we can learn from that, so it's not completely useless. So for example, taking this portrait, what's happening here is that what was the line of symmetry down the centre of his face has been obviously pushed to that side, and in doing so, this half of his face has been visually squashed. This half of his face has been visually stretched. Now, I can demonstrate this on my own face if you bear with me. Okay, so if I look straight at you and not up, not down, okay, this oval theory applies. I've got a line of symmetry down the centre, and my eyes are on this level about halfway up, bottom of nose and mouth, okay? But the moment I turn to one side, even slightly, this half of my face visually is getting squashed, including my eye, including any part of my face, this side is squashed. It's really worth remembering this. For example, the line, the gap, if you like, between, for example, the edge, the very edge of my eye and the very edge of my face, from your perspective, is much narrower than this side. If you look from the corner of my eye to the wherever you see the edge of my head on this side, you'll notice there's a huge difference there. And again, we can see that very clearly here. We've got a very small gap there, much bigger gap there. Similarly, if I either lower my chin or raise my chin, you should notice a whole difference of what you can see. If I raise my chin, you should be able to see less, much less of the back of my head, okay? And more, if anything, of my jaw and neck and so on. If I lower my chin, then you should be able to see more of the back of my head and potentially less of this. It depends how far I go down, okay? So you can see what's going on here, but what happens when you get a sort of really complex pose like so, and the eyes and so on doing something quite unusual, is we tend to forget all of that. We tend to draw or paint what we think we see rather than what we actually see. And that's where I want you to bear this in mind for the whole of these exercises and really try to draw what you see rather than what you think you see. I should say at this point, if you prefer to draw or paint animal portraits, that's absolutely fine. They are very legitimately portraits, in my opinion. But interestingly, exactly the same principles that we've just been talking about with the squashing of one side of the face, the stretching of the other half, still applies. So, for example, if you've got a passport photo of a lion, it's not quite, but it's very nearly fully, you know, from the front. You've got that symmetry, not quite an oval, but roughly speaking, those sort of similar ideas. Whereas if you have a face that's looking up, looking away, raised chin, you see much less of the back of the head. You see that squashing and that stretching. Very much as we did with the still life project, I want you to start by focusing on observational studies of portraits, by which I mean starting with very simple, maybe 2-minute, maybe 5-minute sketches. Actually set yourself a timer if that helps you. Don't think of it as working against the clock, think of it as focusing your mind. But what we want to do is to start with very simple sketches and work gradually towards more developed and longer duration ones. And as you're doing that, try to loosen up your whole style, your whole approach. Try to let go of those inhibitions that we tell ourselves that we're doing this all wrong. Try to let all of that go. Try to focus on just getting down the bare essentials. Let's start with this particular reference here. Now this one's a really interesting one, and we could use this to demonstrate a lot of those points that we were making earlier. We can use it particularly to see how we've got a face that's turning to one side, maybe slightly tilted, maybe slightly up. We can also look at things like lighting, which is really interesting in this. Notice a lot of these references that I've got here are monochrome, black and white, which frees me up in terms of my approach to the colour. If you start with a monochrome image, it gives you a neutral starting point from which you can look at the tonal values and think of those in any colour you like. Right, let's pin this up. In fact, I'm going to pin it even more closely beside my canvas here, which is just a piece of paper. I'm actually going to set my timer. Let's make the first one 2 minutes. 2 minutes is going to be bare essentials only. I understand that. Don't feel that your sketch needs to look finished by any stretch of the imagination. This is simply to focus your mind and keep you going. I don't want you to panic and think, oh my God, I've only got 2 minutes. You're just using that as a focus. Just want to choose something that's going to show up on here. And let's see. I'm keeping my pencil very loose, not applying much pressure. What I'm looking at principally is angles and shapes and how they relate to one another. Notice here, for example, you've got the line of the eyes. So obviously what we've got here is a very loose sketch, but I want to just point out a few things that I'm observing as I work on this. For example, things like the tilt, the angle, if you like, of those eyes, they are not level because she's turned away and her head is slightly tilted as well. So that angle there is something that if it helps, just actually use a pencil or a pen or something, take that angle across. Another thing that will help you with any drawing skills is taking a line down from something. So once you've established something like the end, the edge of the corner of that eye, you can then take it down, take a line down from it and find that it's the end of the edge of the nostril. Take a line down from here, find it's the edge of that nostril there. That's the sort of thing that I'm looking for when I'm drawing the whole time, whether it's a face, whether it's a car or a building or whatever. Right, now let's do, for example, a 5-minute sketch. Okay, let's go. Really thinking about how much of this space I want to actually fill apart from anything else. Looking at that eye, the actual shape of that eye. Notice how much of that eye space is actually white relative to the iris. Notice how much space there is between the eyebrows relative to, for example, the width of that eye. It's about the same. Notice the angle of the nose. If you need to take it over, take it over. How long is the nose? Well, you've already got something else you can compare it with. It's sort of like that, roughly speaking. So you've always got, as soon as you've got something established, you can usually work everything else out from that. And what I like to do is sort of, again, double check. You take a line down from here, it's going to give us the edge of that nostril. That's correct. So we know we're sort of on the right lines. Again, that little bit of a shadow there, it's not a strong line, but it's going to give us an angle. And we've got a bit of a curve coming around to the edge of the mouth here. This little bit of dark at the edge of a mouth is really important because it tells us a lot about the expression. You can, if you like, take a line down from, say, the centre of the eye to give us where that should come. Okay. Look at the angles of the lips. Angle there, angle there. And let's say from the corner of that nostril down to where the lip, the line between the lips flattens out. We've got quite a strong shadow here, which we can put in later if we have more time. Might not have time in the 5-minute slot, but we've got some. Notice the relative size of those lips, for example, as well. The lower lips the lower lip tends to be a lot wider, a lot thicker than the top lip. It also tends to have a lot more light on it, simply because of the angle. So that's much darker usually. And we can begin to block in some areas of light here. Light there. So I'm looking at the strongest highlights really. Oops. If you're working at an easel, do always make sure it's not going to collapse on you. Notice that gap between the edge of the mouth and the edge of the face. And ditto once we get the rest of this eye in. If you find that you run out of time and you've still got another eye to put in or something, don't panic. I mean, it really doesn't matter. This is all to show evidence of observational study. It doesn't matter if these are unfinished. It doesn't matter at all. This gap here is very small indeed, between the edge of the eye and the edge of her face. And we can just indicate what she's wearing. There we go. Very loose sketch, but it gives the essentials of what we're looking at. Okay, what should we do now? 10 minutes maybe? Gradually build these up so that you're giving yourself a bit more time to do something more in depth. I think let's use some Posca pens on this one. Doing these sketches is a great opportunity to experiment with different mediums, different styles, begin to really loosen up, because at the end of the day what you're creating, these pieces are not meant to be finished pieces, but they are, each one, it could be an experiment. So really use that opportunity to experiment freely, loosen up, see what works, what doesn't, what you like, what you don't like. Using marker pen on this one is giving it a really bold, graphic sort of quality. Again, not something that you might want, for example, on a portrait of a young baby, for example, that where you really want that sort of softness. But it's quite an interesting sort of style to experiment with. particularly when you come to things like shoulders, notice where relative to anything else you've already got that shoulder comes, because most of us seem to make necks much too thin. I don't know why, just sort of we don't imagine that they start where they actually do. I'm thinking that's actually about there. Shoulder. Always give your portraits a context. Don't leave them sort of floating. That's actually a bit high. Bring that down to about there. But always leave your, give your portraits an actual context so they're not just floating in midair. Got 2.5 minutes left, in fact, of that 10 minutes. I might just carry on and do a little bit more on this, or I might sort of leave it there because I quite like it the way it is. Really, all I'm trying to show you at this point is just to experiment freely as you like with these. At this point, you could do a lot of things with this. You could do paper cutting into it. You could add acrylics or pastels, or you could collage with it, fragment it slightly, etc. You could obviously also add a lot more detail than this. What I like on this sort of background is the fact that it shows through anywhere where you haven't made any marks. You've got that strong red colour, which is quite an interesting effect in itself. Anyway, let's stop the clock just there. Now I've set our timer for 25 minutes just to give myself that bit more time to build up the level of detail and so on, shading, contours. Don't feel that it has to be precisely 25 minutes. You could set it for 45 minutes or an hour, whatever feels right to you in terms of just building up a bit more detail and developing that study. For this one, I'm going to use some acrylic paint. I tend to keep my acrylics inside an airtight container. This is the sort of thing you find in the kitchen. It keeps them fresh for potentially weeks in between sessions when you're not using them, so that's really useful in terms of conserving materials. Let's just add a tiny bit more colour. This particular colour I find really useful for portraits generally. This is Naples yellow, which is a very gentle, sort of sunny Mediterranean yellow. It's not a harsh lemon yellow, it's very gentle. And you'll see in all of my portraits, they have that sort of, that Naples yellow, especially if you're working on a dark background, as I often do, in fact. I've found a sheet of black card, which is rather nice. It gives a very dramatic effect with portraits, especially if you're working on a black background or something like that, then white is obviously going to be really useful. Let's actually do an animal portrait this time. Okay, let's go for it. I might just use water even to start with. No paint at all. Using just water, I can very roughly sketch in where I'm going with this and potentially eye up, and if I don't like the way that the composition's worked out, then I can just let it dry. But that looks about right to me, so let's go for a little bit of paint now. And we don't want too much paint to begin with. In fact, that's maybe too much. Let's just water that down a little bit, and we can just begin to rough this in. I'm looking, where does that eye start? If I sort of make a rough circle there, then it's basically just comes out from there. There's an angle of the eyes there. We can, if you like, take that down. How far between the eyes, you know, what spacing between the eyes. If anything, it's slightly more than the width of an eye. It's quite different from a human face in that respect. Okay. Again, if in doubt about this angle, just simplify it down to a straight line and put it in. Where does that ear come out? Well, we can take a line up from here, so we know where that ear comes out. Notice how little paint I'm using at this point. This is one of those funny brushes. I think I might just get an ordinary brush. I do love those brushes, but this is slightly more sort of mainstream just for this exercise. Right, let's press on. So these markings around the, I think it's a leopard or jaguar, around the jaguar's eyes are really important. Animal markings or animal faces tend to have really definite markings, possibly around their noses, muzzles, eyes, eyebrows, ears, etc. So it's a bit like when humans wear makeup, they sort of exaggerate their features, but even with animals, although they don't wear anything like that, they have these very accentuated features often. So it's really useful to emphasize those when you're doing animal portraits particularly. Lots of light here and here, very little light as we go off here, so I can use my fingers just to sort of smudge that and make it a softer line. Same here. There are very few hard lines on faces, whether human or animal, so it's quite useful to use your fingers just to smudge and smooth out lines, I always find. So there you've got a hard line, just going to smooth it, smudge it, soften it. And notice I'm still constantly looking back at my reference, probably every second at least. If you can train yourself to just glance back at regular intervals, very regular intervals, you'll find that your drawing skills will improve immensely. Every few minutes, step back, just have a look at it from a distance, make sure it's, you know, evolving as you want it to. Again, like I said earlier, I'm going to make sure that I give this context, as in I'm going to give it shoulders, neck, etc., rest of the body, or just a context to be aware of. So it's not just a decapitated head floating in space. Okay, we've got all this light spilling down here. Obviously, because I'm working on a black background, it gives me the opportunity to use the black to show through where I want the darkest bits. Where these lovely highlights are in the very lowest part of those eyes, for example, I can just put those in. I'm not really painting an eye, I'm painting what I see here, which are shapes and a little speck of light. Here, what can we see there? Well, we've got a light sort of, I would say there, if anything, just curling around there, and a tiny bit of a highlight there. That should be enough really to give you the sense that it's an eye. Obviously, when in other animal portraits, human portraits, etc., you might have a bit more detail or a little bit more light in those eyes, but in principle it's exactly like I've just been doing. Just paint what you see rather than what you think you see, and it will look like what it actually is. Okay, now let's begin to add just a little bit of colour here. And when I say add some colour, I'm going to suggest strongly that you add some colour that is unexpected, something that you might not anticipate. So I often go with whatever I like, whatever is in my palette. Some of these are getting a little bit dry, so we might need some more paint, but I'm going to pick up 2 or 3 of those blues. Now, hopefully you can see on there, I've got quite a number of different colours on the brush at the same time. What I haven't done is to mix them all to a fine shade, you know, a flat colour. So let's just see what happens when we put that on there. And you can see there that what's coming out is quite a mixture of different colours. All I'm going to do now is try to match approximately the tonal value of any part of this image. So all I mean by tonal value, for example, this is a really, really dark tone. This is about as dark a tone as we'll find on here. And this is very light. This is possibly even lighter, even lighter. Whereas take something like that spot there, for example, and you've got something that I would call a mid-tone. Ditto here. You know, it's not terribly dark, it's not very light, it's a mid-tone. So when we come to painting that, we want something which isn't, you know, a mid-tone. We want something that isn't too light, isn't too dark, somewhere in between. Okay, let's carry on. This idea of tones should make more sense as you launch in, so I wouldn't worry too much. all I'm doing here is just dipping this into the palette. Some of these are a little bit dry. I might add some more paint in a minute. I'm aware of the time, 15 minutes, so we've still got left. So this is obviously quite a mottled, dappled sort of texture up here. So again, I can make use of the black showing through in places, not too precisely. I'm not a fan of overly precise painting. Let's add a little bit of the purple in to make it darker. So let's see, that's quite a dark tone. Quite a dark tone there. Where do we need that? Sort of, for example, here. You might have noticed I very, very rarely wash my brush out. If you see me dipping it in there, it's generally just to pick up a little bit more water to make the paint flow more easily. If you know anything about acrylics, you'll know that they dry very quickly, unlike oils. Hence the container to keep them fresh for longer. Again, just going to smudge those. You can do a lot with very few colours, I should say that as well. You might want to do the opposite and go for really, bright colours, lots of colours. Turn him into a rainbow jaguar or something. But you could equally do what I'm doing and just use very minimal colours. I hardly need to do much more in these eyes, but if I like, then I can add a little bit more, a little bit of a hint of colour into them as well. And sometimes you can spot very subtle gradations of tones, tonal values. We've got all these lovely spots here. Not being overly precise about any of this, but my whole aim here is to sort of inspire and encourage you to have a go and be quite loose about it, not worry too much, but launch in and hopefully enjoy it in the process. Hopefully I've made it clear how many interesting parallels there are between human and animal portraits as well. So both are equally relevant to the portraits theme. And animals have the advantage, if you like, of not telling you that they're offended by their portraits. So it's often quite a good way to sort of ease yourself into the whole idea of portraiture by painting animals, because you're going to be less worried about the response from the model. This brush, incidentally, is a flat brush, which means that I can, I've got the option of using it that way, or very thin marks if I want to, for example, do these little bits around the whiskers, that sort of thing, or where else, here for example, just to outline things if I need to. always be really aware of your tools when you're doing art and experiment. Really useful to experiment on some scrap paper and just see what your tools actually do before you attempt to put them into practice on your whatever you're working on. What I'm doing here is just almost using a dry brush, I suppose. Very little paint left on there, very little water, just sort of almost picking up that texture of the paper there, so that we've got a little bit of gradation going on there. This is quite light here. I feel like adding just a little bit more there. Let's see, you've got a little bit of orangey colour there. It'd be quite nice to bring a little hint of that in there. A bit more water. And you can see where we've gone with this. Effectively, we've started with a really dark background. We've gone lighter. Then we've gone really quite dark and mid-tone. And now I'm coming back to the lighter end of the scale to put back in, you know, to put in the highlights and the lightest tones that I can see on here. And where can we see them? Well, there's quite a light bit there, maybe even lighter, a bit more white. Just sort of there. Again, using my fingers just to get rid of any hard lines. I'll come on to the whiskers maybe in a minute. Got light, light. We've already put quite a lot of that in. There's quite a lot of light over this side. Sort of just emphasising bits as we go. It's a little bit too light now, I think. Let's just tone it down very slightly. You should see I'm still looking constantly to and fro. And you can see there actually what's happening when I just happen to turn the brush slightly and another colour comes out. That's because I'm not washing my brush out feverishly every 2 minutes. I'm actually absorbing all of those colours into there and thinking, yeah, they actually, you know, when they come out by almost by accident, use that as a little bit of a gift, because it gives a lot more life to your work. Now with whiskers, how are we doing? We've still got nearly 7 minutes left of that time. With whiskers, I would tend to do them very quickly, rather than going down to a sort of a 2-hair brush and taking 15 minutes to do each whisker. I would really advocate doing them very quickly, not worrying too much. It's more like the energy of them that you're trying to capture there. Probably won't have whiskers on human portraits, but you might have things like, you know, bits of hair or things like that, which you could do very, very similarly. Stepping back, I can see I need to adjust tiny bits here and there. That's getting a little bit too light. Just grabbed a palette knife just want to show you a very interesting technique that we could use possibly in the background here. If you've never used a palette knife, then I'd really recommend that you give it a go. What I'm going to do is take a tiniest sliver of paint on here. What we don't want is to put too much detail in this background. We want the focus to be on the face. But all I'm going to do here is use that palette knife to pick up the slight texture of the board behind, or rather the card. Effectively, I'm sort of cleaning my palette knife on here. These are very blunt blades, incidentally. They're not cutting blades at all, but they're great for painting effects. If you try this technique and can't quite get it to work, it's probably because you've got too much paint on the knife at the time. So you need very little paint on here, just the tiniest sliver, really. Sorry about all the noise. Nearly there. Still got 3 minutes left of that 25 minutes. If I want a harder edge on here, I can effectively, let's just do that again, I can place and move the paint away. Something like that. I like this technique because it gives a very sort of distant, hazy, indistinct sort of atmospheric background, which for anything like this, particularly a portrait where you want the emphasis, presumably you want the emphasis on the actual portrait, you can use that to bring that into sharp focus. Personally, I think the background is not as important here because there's quite a light edge to this portrait here, whereas here there's a dark edge, so we needed a light background to lift it forward. Here, that's, to me, that's less important. So I think I'm just going to leave it there for now. With palette knives, brushes, with acrylic paints, one golden rule: always stick them back in the water until you can clean them thoroughly. Okay, really important point, because otherwise they will dry solid and you'll be throwing them away. Okay, enjoy. So I want you now to go and start your own exploration of portraiture based on observational studies. You can see some of the possible options in terms of mediums: coloured pencil, marker pens, acrylics. You could explore other mediums, I'm sure, and gradually build up your portfolio of sketches, drawings, paintings to show that exploratory process. Remember, it's far more important in a lot of ways to show evidence of your process, your creative process, i.e. how you got there, than simply to do a brilliant final piece. Along the way, I want to encourage you to explore a variety of mediums. Don't just stick to one medium. Incidentally, you might have noticed my assistant over here in the corner, Skelly. Skelly is here for a reason. If you're interested in looking at skeletal structure, and particularly in this case, the way that the underlying structure of the skull affects the appearance of a face, That is something that is very valid, not only for human portraits, but for animal portraits as well. Looking at animal skulls or human skulls is a hugely relevant part of portraiture. So if that's something that interests you, then please do explore that further. It's also a rather neat link with our Still Life project. Anyway, I really hope you've enjoyed this session on portraiture. I hope you feel inspired to have a go yourselves, and I look forward to seeing how you get on.